that bedrooms have access to light and air. And that was for multiple reasons, health and also safety. This is just sort of a site plan of how it's not much of an improvement, but it's the beginning of the improvements in building codes and zoning regulations. But they started notching out, or these would be bedrooms back here, started notching out little corners so they could at least have a column of air or some type of egress. I'm going to pause here for a second. Provo's, most of the nation caught on to the zoning movement really quickly after New York adopted formal zoning codes in 1960. It was, in fact, I think Provo was one of probably the earliest adopters in Utah, adopting their own planning commission about 1922, and its first zoning codes not very far after that. And these zoning codes were very simple at the time. We look at our zoning book today, and it's about that much of the city code. City code's about that thick, the zoning code's about that thick. So it's over, I think, close to half, maybe over half of the zoning code today. Originally, these zoning codes were maybe a dozen pages, or less. And originally, the very motive of creating zoning was, again, to ensure basic health, safety, welfare, and to separate incompatible uses. And especially back in the industrial, where there's very little regulations in the Industrial Revolution, you'd have dangerous laundry facilities with all sorts of chemicals, and they'd be next to these residential areas, and they'd explode and people die. And so that was one of the original reasons for zoning, was to ensure that we separate those things which are not compatible. I glossed over the 1930s, 40s, and 50s zoning maps, but they're much simpler than this one, and they really only had about 5 or 6 zoning. Well, until the 50s, they only had about 5 or 6 zoning classifications. Agriculture, I think 2 degrees of commercial and like 2 degrees of residential and industrial, if I remember right. However, as zoning has evolved over the last 100 years, especially in the 50s or 70s and early 80s, zoning codes got ever increasingly more complicated. And that's a whole other hour discussion. I'm not going to get really into that. But really, it's gotten complicated, even in our own zoning code, where I threw out one extreme example here. In our SC1, which is a neighborhood shopping center zone, we permit veterinary clinics, but not a pet grooming business. So the ever-increasing separation of uses have gotten to that detail in our zoning, and that's fairly prevalent through most communities. The 60s and 70s was a boom for classifying everything as being a potential noxious use. The plan, we even took it to residential, that even on, and we still do this today, and we're caught up in this, whether right or wrong. I'm probably seem biased, but just by mentioning it, we even separate out residences by lot size. For some reason, a 6,000 square foot lot is not appropriate next to an 8,000 square foot lot. So we have R16 zones, 8 zones, and 10 zones. Again, it probably comes back to this idea of protecting property values, and if somebody develops a lesser or a smaller home than mine, that's going to attract my property values. I don't know if that's really the case, but that's probably was the thinking when we started developing these lot size provisions back in the 70s. So what I show here, though, is our 1964 zoning map, and this I'm segueing just a little bit more into what really prompted, I think. And this is my theory. This is based off my research and working in planning and zoning and all the discussions I've heard. I definitely wasn't around here in 1964. I was the twinkle in my parents' eyes. But from what I can put together, it was post, 1950s, President Wilkinson had made, and is infamous, but the call to allow, they were increasing enrollment, they made a call to those surrounding neighborhoods to open up their homes to accommodate the increase of enrollment. Okay. Now, I have all sorts of theories of what happened between owner-occupants opening up their homes to them moving elsewhere and converting their homes into rentals. And you probably come with your own theories about why that happened. But somehow that happened, okay? And in that movement, by 1964, which wasn't too long after this, I think maybe 5 to 10 years, there was a radical shift in Provo City zone, okay, where almost all of the downtown zones were significantly upzoned to what is called R6 on this map. Now don't get confused. These maps prior to 1970 do not correlate to our current zoning maps. So an R6 is probably the equivalent to today's R4 zone, okay, or maybe possibly R5 zone. High density apartment zone. And I think high density for the time was probably still 3 to 5 stories. We're not talking downtown stuff. And as you go out, I think we're typically looking at 3-story stuff. By 1984, there had been some significant revisions. Now, these numbers do correlate more to what the terms that we talked to, R1 through R5 zones. And, well, let me back up here. You can see that it was, this higher density was pretty much applied, and it's hard to read. This is R16A, R16, R7, R6, R8. R8 allowed for some commercial development mixed in. It was very high density. It was planned for arterial streets. About a half-acre lot could accommodate 12 units under that zone, as I figured. It was across the board, and again, this is my theory. I haven't found the document or the meeting minutes that validates my theory, but also knowing the planning history of the time, my theory is that the 60s saw everything old ought to be redeveloped. There was no such thing as historic preservation per se at that time period, and it was the age of modernism, and we need to reinvent the wheel on everything, and who wants that old Victorian stuff? It is time to bulldoze that down and redevelop. That was the planning mindset of largely of the 60s. Okay, and from that, and that's a general nationwide trend that happened. I'm assuming it infected Provo, and I'm assuming based off this map that they had wide-scale redevelopment plans for downtown Provo. They wanted the ability for everything to be torn down and redeveloped. Now, there may be some type of merit to that type of planning scheme in some situations, but even if you found that appropriate, they upzoned far more than the market would demand. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and why I think that's relevant to this discussion. By 1984, there was some modifications. I'm not sure why, but by 20 years later, some of the further from campus neighborhoods were downzoned. This one where I live today is an R2 zone, which still allowed for duplexes and conversions of single-family homes into 2 units. By the way, often it didn't just allow for redevelopment, it allowed for conversion, which is of homes into multiple units, which is another pressing issue as part of this discussion. Down here in Mazer, it was downzoned to R2, but as you got closer to campus, they actually increased the densities to what we call R5 today, and that was, for many years, the highest density zoning in the city. By the year 2000, this just gives you a better sense. Some of the R2 areas, this relates, well, let me back up a step. Again, my understanding, I wasn't here in Provo in the 80s, But there was the beginning of the neighborhood revitalization efforts. Okay, and some former council members, Cindy Rich in particular, and other people whose names I'm sure many of you would recognize, started to get involved and say, wait a second, it's time to stop sort of the encroachment of this type of development. And I'll show you some examples of what I mean by this type of development. We need to stop this. We're on this downward trend. We're seeing increased crime rates. We're seeing increase in rentals. Those that want to stay are feeling that they're being pushed out. We need to fight this, and I think it was the beginning of a movement in these neighborhoods, and eventually by 2000 the policies started changing for these neighborhoods. It wasn't a complete down zone, but it was a down zone from duplexes from many of these areas, from the R2 zoning, which allowed for homes to be converted into duplexes, to an R1 6A zone, which was a one-family residential zone. It did still allow for somebody to create an accessory apartment if they owned the property, well, if the owner lived in the property. And that zoning still exists for much of these neighborhoods. That's my home is in the R1 6A zone. By 2003, though, continuing developments led the city council to take the rest of the high-density zones and downzone them to the residential conservation zone. Okay, essentially what that zone did was put a development, a density hold on nearly everything except for downtown. And what a density hold is, rather than a pure down zone, is if you had an existing 12-plex under the RC zone, you could rebuild a 12-plex, but you couldn't get additional units. If you only had a single-family home, you could get no additional units. So that's why I characterize it as a density hold. Any questions on that? Button too many times. Let me just give you a little bit more ancient history as far as Provo goes. The city was developed initially in 1851, 49. Was laid out. And actually, we don't see this anywhere in the city anymore, but the original block was 4 lots to the block. These are 1 acre blocks, 1 acre lots, well shy of 1 acre each. Over time, we had our own infill of original Pioneer, and typically most blocks infilled in this manner, from this to this. And this is significant because I think it affected how these rezones took form and shape in these neighborhoods. So, any questions on this? I'm going to flip this light down just a little bit.
Matt, could you go back to that one? Go back one. So that would kind of explain why some of these older homes had these long, deep lots and long, skinny backyards, because they were that configuration.
Yeah, you could get out of the original lot five lots if you made some deep and a couple others short.
Okay.
Now this is these would be a 4,900 square foot lot, 49 by 100 feet. These are usually 49 and a half. 49 and a half by 199 feet. So just shy of 10,000 square feet.
Okay.
So here is one example. Sorry, most of the examples come from a neighborhood because that's where I'm riding around on my bike, and that's where I get a chance to take pictures. And I just really ran out of time to go represent other neighborhoods. So one, I am biased. I really do love my neighborhood, but it really was an issue of time here that I didn't have examples from elsewhere.
I'm impressed that you got this from your bike.
Yeah, that's
I'm pretty impressive. That's right. I have a friend. Not this one. This is in Franklin neighborhood. This is an example. You can see the deep lots. You can see on this side the short lots. You can see where typically there would have been 2 homes here. This 60s era or maybe early 70s era apartment complex wedged in there. Okay, and even though the zoning in the 60s allowed you to redevelop just one of those little skinny lots, once you added in the setbacks and the parking, ingress and egress requirements and the parking area and open space provisions, you had to take out 2 lots. Very rarely will you just see one of these lots redeveloped with this many units, although it may have allowed up to 12 units, like I said. Oh, you can't see that very well. Sorry, I took it this morning, and it was still dawn. So, but what you can see here, this is actually one of the better ones in my opinion, because there's no parking I can't see any parking from the street. Here's this bungalow, couple big apartments, bungalow. Okay. And multiple issues going on, I think, for the neighborhoods in this revitalization effort that began in the early 90s. Is one, you have the transiency issue. Okay, rentals, people coming and going. There was, I think, some deteriorating issues in the neighborhood. I think we've been rebounding in the last decade. My understanding, as I talked to my neighbors, is things were much worse in this early 90s period as far as crime and other type of unwanted activities. But we also have urban design issues. Okay, it's just when you just something wrong with the street here. Okay, and I could spend probably 30 minutes talking about urban design philosophy, but who disagrees that there's something wrong with the urban design here? Okay, no thought was given to how do we fit these structures in an appropriate way. Well, there was thought, but as I read the code, it was counter to everything I would think today, and that I think anybody in this room would think. Really different mindset back when they developed these codes. This one turned out a little bit better. Now this one is far worse in my opinion. You got to see it parking out in front of the complex. Home. And the scale's wrong, the roof forms are wrong, the interaction with the street is wrong. And that just detracts from the neighborliness of the neighborhood, the aesthetic value, and in addition to the other things that came along. Just a couple other examples. Home. This is actually the one we saw from above. Parking, complex, home. You see the home a little better here. This one's not my neighborhood. This is on the way to the rec center. That's why I grabbed it. French mansard roof design. I don't know. Really took hold in that period. Don't get it, but it did. Flat roof. This one's probably late 50s, early 60s. Next to this Victorian.
That looks like a storage unit on the left.
Yeah, and we could get into this. I mean, there's no interaction with the street. There's no doors. There's no windows. There's just all sorts of. Again, that's a whole hour discussion about urban design and how all these things. This is actually I stole this. Thank you, Gary and Bill, for letting me steal this from the Joaquin Master Plan. They did great work, I think, on this plan as far as, especially with the data analysis. And if you look at this map, you can see the extent that this happened. Now, in some senses, that makes more sense than other neighborhoods because it is closer to campus. It is where the students were more often living. Oh, I have a caveat to that. The browns are apartment buildings. These are apartment building forms. And most of them, as you drive around there, well, many of them will be a similar quality and design of the pictures that we've shown you. Some are newer, they do better, but even then I think there were still concerns. Even the newer ones weren't quite making the cut. Stephen can probably have lots to say about it. You live in that neck of the woods. As you get further south, you can see that more and more of the units remained untouched. However, these little orange blotches indicate that they were cut up into multiple units. It was again an issue with tenure of length of occupancy. This is just a quick and dirty map I made, and this is my neck of the woods, about 2 miles away from campus. You still see this peppering of this type of development inserted amongst all this historic single-family type. This does not even include the conversions. This is just the apartment building. So there's a lot more on this map that would be houses cut up into multiple units. Primarily, I think it was easy because if you couldn't assemble the property closer to campus, why not just hop in your car and drive to campus? Okay, it was the automobile age. We're still dealing with that. And how do we get students out of their cars? Long old problem. All right, before we get on to that, I have another slide. Oh, I did have another slide. In this material I'll send out is a few pictures, just to say this increasing trend to separate noxious uses and separate everything from everything else. In most planning circles, that trend is reversing. We're looking for more and more ways to appropriately mix compatible uses. And so I just threw out a few pictures that we, even in Provo, we're moving that way, where we have the Wells Fargo, which mixes commercial, residential, and office. Even in the 80s, sorry, Pizza Factory. This is my favorite example of 80s mixed use. There's very little 80s mixed use, but Pizza Factory successfully combines office and pizza. So I can't get any better than that. If you got to Daybreak, you can see some of what I call horizontal mixed use. It may not be stacked on top of each other, but we have a very quick transition between single-family homes to apartments to urban office, and these type of mixtures are ever increasing in the planning. A lot of reasons for that. That's a whole other hour discussion. We'll move on from that. How do we deal? So really the question is, how did we deal and how did we counteract this? Because even though we've kept on trying to improve our development codes and our zoning, the projects still never kept on. The projects still weren't turning out the way that we hoped as a city. And there was still concern in the neighborhood, the council. We adopted design guidelines. The design guidelines were still allowing developments to come in that were not. The outcome was less than hopeful. Okay. We have, you see how thick our zoning code is, and we still have this problem of quality development that fit in appropriately with neighborhoods. Okay. This was, I think, compounded by a few other factors, especially when rezones were being requested. This is a case of what you see is when what you see is not what you get. So, who recognizes this building? Well, Gary does. But not in the flesh. This is as far as it went. I went to the council. They needed rezone. The site project plan was 8th North and 5th West. And this is the developer comes in and says, I need a rezone to accommodate this project. That's what you have today. Okay. Now, both uses, 100% legal under the commercial general zone.
Matt, it's hard to see. Is that again?
This is
The Chevron.
Sorry, I grabbed this one from Street View because I was out of time again. But this is the Chevron on 5th West and 8th North. The little deli mart and the Gandolfo's, which I endorse Gandolfo's, and the car wash.
And the Doctor's Park is diagonally.
So instead of that beautiful building, okay.
Okay.
That's great.
This was perfectly legal. There was, and I think probably over the years, and I probably was perpetuating this idea that the developers did a bait and switch. They promised one thing, they delivered another. As I get back into the actual case file records, it seems more evident that the financing for the project didn't come through. And they had to change the plan. They went scrambling basically and said, well, if we can't get the financing for this, what else can we do? Well, we can do this. It's easy. Let's get it done. Let's get our money. Let's get out of the project. Okay. Now, Some people really like that gas station, like Brian.
I'm glad
It is one of the better gas
on my way
stations.
home. I'm glad I live. I used to live.
But I think it reinforced for policymakers at this time of, not only have we been trying to improve our zoning codes, we can't even trust that they'll deliver once we approve the rezone. Okay.
How many cases you have of this in the city?
I can't tell you.
I think it's important to know. Right?
I don't.
I've
How many
heard of
times
that
that's
quite a
happened? I couldn't put a number on it.
The experts are sitting against the
I don't know
wall.
if they. I mean, they're welcome to respond.
few.
How many
Yeah.
times have we been shown one thing and something else has been built?
Yeah.
Certainly, that was kind of like the icing on the cake that made the city and decide development agreements were essential. It happens periodically, not frequently, but sometimes in a while.
It's happened a lot less lately, but talk about that.
Well, one thing we do, when we look at a project, somebody asks for a rezone, they're asking for a zone. And the code has all these sorts of uses and all sorts of standards and everything that applies. And so we always think, okay, what's the worst case scenario? The project comes in, they get the rezone, and the financing falls through, but the ground's still rezoned. What's the worst case scenario that they can do on the ground? And if we're not comfortable with the things that can happen in that rezone in general, then we would recommend no. Because those are the rules that apply on the ground. You know, in this case, this is one where some people didn't get what they thought they were going to get, because the picture that was shown was that office building. I think one preliminary question is, you know, when a zone comes in and somebody's asking for a whole regulatory system that allows multiple things, you know, how far down into the details of it do you really want to go? And yeah, I can see where people would want that building, but as far as a use in planning in a community, frankly, we're okay with the gas station then. That ended up being a decent use in that area. And the market showed that that was more successful than in the office building.
Now, later in the discussion, we'll turn to Randy next, but we'll talk about some ways to potentially move past just the focus solely on use, is it appropriate use, to more holistically use and design, because really a lot of these issues are design driven. Randy.
Well, it seems like this is an issue that planning has wrestled with, because if we approve the rezone, we can't make that contingent upon the project plan actually being what they proposed. And so they can go back after the rezone has been approved and change their project plan or sell the property, and there's nothing that we can do about it. Is there some way to actually work through that in a development agreement? It seems like to me.
Well, we're going to get it. Yeah, we're going to get into how we've done that with development agreements, how we've limited to, again, what you see is what you get. We're going to talk about, and that's one of the advantages of using it. We're going to talk more fully about that.
You know, in this particular case, I know the neighbors mentioned that they were expecting a building that would be used from 8 to 5 weekdays. And what they got was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, car wash, lots of noise, a lot more traffic. And so the neighbors immediately to the east began selling out, and it really sort of led to the change in that particular part of that neighborhood.
This idea of use, and again, that's why I started way back in 1880 and 1916, is, again, one of the original focuses of zoning was separation of incompatible use. So again, here you're talking about neighbors. And is that type of use compatible next to this car wash and 24/7 compatible next to this neighbors? On the flip side, we have 2 arterial streets, well, arterial and collector street. So, and then, you know, balancing property rights. So it's a complicated problem to solve. But again, I started way back when because the emphasis for until probably the last 15 years in planning have been solely use, maybe 20 years. 15 years, I think it has more pliable tools on it. But how do we separate uses that don't get along? And I think what's taken us a back seat to the whole discussion is it so much the use, or how does the building facilitate that use in a way that's friendly to the neighborhood or friendly to the adjacent property? Okay.
I almost wonder if when we have, when neighborhood meetings are held, that it should be explained to neighbors that a project has a rezone attached to it, and that there are other possibilities that might occur if this particular development doesn't happen for one reason or another. Here are the permitted uses for that zone. I think it would make a big difference, maybe, in how the neighbors view and how they vote during that neighborhood meeting and how they express themselves. If we're going to have full disclosure and transparency with the neighbors, you know, maybe a gas station is a wonderful use there. But when the neighbors got together years ago for that neighborhood meeting, they had no idea a gas station was a possibility and that they might end up having to sell their homes. And so, you know, I don't know. That's something that ought to be, yeah.
But at the same time, they're voting for a building that was going to be commercial. That's not residential. That's not neighbor.
Yeah, but it's an 8
It's adjacent to.
Right. And so I don't think that you can educate a bunch of people about what's going to be happening. It's something that has to be done on the code. If you're allowing for commercial development right in that corner, then of course it's up to the developer to decide what that's going to be. If they run out of money, yet all those things can happen. But the neighborhood can also, you know, say, how do you know? The neighborhood, how do they even bring that up when it's in the future?
Well, because there's a big difference between commercial as in doctor's office and commercial as in 24-hour gas station.
The hindsight is a big difference, but not in the moment of the planning. When the planning doesn't know what's going to happen tomorrow, they don't know what might happen in 2 weeks from then if the bank doesn't approve the financing.
We're going to talk a little bit later about some ways to potentially address that very issue. I'd like to turn a little bit.
Adding intrigue to this specific case are the larger designs of IHC. And so that's sort of on the horizon, this ominous movement to 8th North that ultimately will dictate what that area looks like, because they're buying all those houses.
That's true.
I'd like to turn a few moments over to Brian Jones. He's been studying quite a bit on the legal side of development agreements, and I'd like to give him an opportunity to talk a little bit about how they're typically used and how we've traditionally used them.
Okay. Greetings this evening. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brian Jones, and I've been serving as the legal counsel for the Municipal Council for 2.5 years now, I think. And I owe you 3 apologies to start off with. First one is that a lot of the stuff I'm going to say, especially in the next few minutes, is probably stuff you've heard before. But as I was putting together my PowerPoints, I decided I probably needed to say it anyways to make sure we were on the same page. 2, I don't have any pictures, so it's not nearly as entertaining as Matt's. And 3, I had this great story about an interaction with my wife that I was going to share right at the beginning to break the ice, and then just as I sat down, I realized it goes much better in the middle of my presentation, so I'm going to save it for later and not start with the joke. So we're just going to dive right in, but Bryce is going to bring up my slides for me. And if anybody needs a break for a caffeinated beverage before I start, it might be a good idea.
It all depends how long you're going to go.
Have you seen all the stuff I piled on the table? Okay, so let's talk. So yeah, exactly. So Matt has done a great job of laying the framework of the regulatory issues that gave rise to development agreements coming up in the first place. And so I'm going to start, and this is really remedial, I suppose, but this is the law that we often refer to as LUDMA, or the Land Use and Development Management Act. Okay, this one is actually the municipal one. There's also one called CLUDMA, which says almost the exact same things, but it's for the county, right? So this is our municipal order and municipal ordinance, and what it says in this first section is it defines what the purposes of land use regulation are. Okay, and I think most of them are familiar to all of you, but that's going to come into play. It comes into play with what Matt talked about, and it's going to come into play again as we move forward. I'm not going to read them all, but is it okay to go on? Okay. So the first question is, what is a development agreement, since that's what this meeting is about. So in the section right after the one that I just showed you, it says the following, which is great legalese here, especially since most of the stuff gets repeated twice. But anyway, what it says is that ordinances, and this language right here was added in 2005. And what it says is that in order to meet all the purposes that I just showed you, cities can do certain things. And it says in that paragraph that one of the things they can do is development agreements. Now, that's the only place in the state code that it mentions them. Okay? Well, kind of. It's actually mentioned 13 times, but 9 of the times are references to tollway development agreements, which are agreements with the state regarding the development of toll roads. One of them is where we just looked at. One of them is the county version of the same thing, and 2 of them are for the development of military installations. Okay? So nowhere in state code does it define what a development agreement is. What we just looked at, that's it, as far as what development agreements are to be used for. Okay, so let's look at city code. It is mentioned 3 times in the city code and once in the general plan, but the first 2 instances are specific to either a pro-zone or to a certain situation. The 3rd instance talks about applications for pro-zones, and the reference in the general plan says, hey, if you're doing a specific development plan for an area, the developer entitlements can be defined by a development agreement. Now, not to give too much away, but as this is going to be relevant in a few minutes, I want you to notice that it says the developer entitlements can be defined in the development agreement. Okay, we'll come back. So there's no definition in city code. There is, though, kind of interestingly enough, a chapter of city code, 15.19, that is reserved for a development agreement ordinance, but there's not actually an ordinance in the chapter. So we must have thought about it at one point, but we haven't enacted one. And Gary and Bill can probably know more about that. So if it's not defined, what is it? Well, okay, maybe it's just what it says it is. Maybe it's just an agreement that a developer is a party to. And to be honest, a lot of times that's the way it gets used. If you look back to what I just showed you in state code, they use the phrase several times, but it means something completely different in every context. So essentially, it is used in lowercase letters to mean any agreement that a developer ends up being a party to or that is about development. Well, that doesn't tell us very much, so let's look at, real briefly at where they came from. And this is where you're really going to just love this presentation and feel like, as Mr. Miller said, that you're in a law class. Development agreements originally arose out of attempts to solve 2 tensions involving developers and cities regarding land use law, vesting and exactions. So you've probably heard most of this before about what these 2 things are, but we're going to cover it really briefly. So vesting. This is the idea that at some point in the development process, the developer has incurred costs sufficient that it would be unfair if the city just changed the rules of the game and took his right to develop his property away from him. And so, because development costs a lot of money, and some of that money is incurred long before you even put a shovel to the ground. And none of the money can be recovered until after the development is all the way done, and you're renting or selling the property, leasing it. So there's this principle that once that right to do the project vests, the city can't change the rules. And so, for instance, with the one that we just looked at, that Matt showed us, after we approved the zone to say you can build this office building on the corner of 5th West, we could, well, this one's a little bit tricky because they didn't actually put in an application for the gas station. But the idea is that you can't then, let's say they were still going to build the office building. You can't then change the zoning law and say, you know what, we don't allow office buildings in this zone anymore, okay? Because they've relied on the fact that that's what they were going to be able to to build. Okay, so the timing of when that happens varies a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The common law rule is that the government has to take an action, either an affirmative action or an omission, and the developer then has to rely on that action and have some financial investment, some skin in the game. And once those two things happen, their rights to go ahead and finish the project can vest. Now, a lot of states say you've got to spend a significant amount of money, and that's not usually defined. There's Florida cases that say as little as $8,000 is sufficient to trigger vesting. There's other states. California had a case where, and this actually led to the adoption of the development agreement statute in California. But California had a case where the developer put in, I think it was $30 million. And the California Court of Appeals said, sorry, you don't vest until you've actually started construction, no matter how much money you've spent. And they hadn't started, so they weren't vested. So here's the Utah rule. The Utah Supreme Court has adopted, pretty much, in my view, a much more liberal rule than the two that we just looked at. And this is in the case of Western Land Equities versus Logan, a 1980 case. And it says, an applicant is entitled to favorable action if the application conforms to the zoning ordinance in effect at the time of the application, unless there's already pending changes or unless there's a compelling public welfare reason to not do that. And so essentially this case says once they submit the application, if the application complied with the law at the time it was submitted, they get to have their application considered under the rules at that time. Even if you can't make subsequent changes to those rules, or at least if you do, they don't apply to that application. Any questions about that? Yes.
Yeah, what if nothing happens for 3 years or something?
Very good. That's an excellent question. And in the case, I didn't include obviously all the quotes I could have, but there's another quote in the case where it talks about if the developer doesn't move forward with reasonable diligence, that can negate their vesting rights.
Okay.
Does it specifically outline a time limit?
No. It uses that phrase.
No, our city code has some time limits.
Yes, and I'll get in a second to, I won't go to the city code, I'll get in a second to what the state code says about it, which also includes that. Yes?
So in the Maverick example, could the application be construed to include the information about the office building that they proposed, or how does that work?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, go ahead, Gary.
Well, what happened in that case? The Chevron?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, what happened in that case is they came in, they got a rezone. They're working on their project plan. And the project plan, they couldn't get financing, so they came in and just submitted materials that amended what they were doing. And it was as if they submitted a brand new project plan. There was no rules against it in the code. And so they had a complete application. They were vested. There's no reason to turn it down under a code. And so they can just go forward.
But in theory, if a little bird had come and told us what they were going to do, and we could hurry and pass an ordinance taking, unzoning the property or taking gas stations out of that zone before they submitted their application, that theoretically would have been permissible. The problem is logistically making that happen.
Well, we had a question about application, I don't know, with the MTC. What constitutes a complete application?
Great question. Okay, so we'll move on and look at the code. Okay, so this case was back in 1980. The legislature later passed their own law to negate legal fighting in the courts over what that 1980 case meant. The legislature came back and adopted a statute that implemented the same rules but put some more definition in place. And so that rule says if they filed a complete land application, they're entitled to review under the rules in effect at the time of the application, and they're entitled to approval according to the rules in time at the place of the application, unless there's a compelling countervailing public interest, which was in the court case, which, by the way, is a pretty high standard, or before the application is submitted, we already had a pending ordinance change. Okay. And then there's some rules about that pending ordinance change has to be acted upon within 180 days, or else that doesn't stop it either. Okay? All right, so we can't withhold approval if they're entitled to it under the rules that we just talked about. So here's your question here. An application for land use approval is considered submitted and complete when it's provided in a form that complies with the requirement of applicable ordinances. So that's why our city code has provisions in it that define what a complete ordinance is. Gary, do you want to say anything about those? About what we consider to be a complete ordinance?
A complete application.
A complete application, sorry.
Yeah, we do have some definitions defining it, and we've tried to clean them up over the years. In the MTC one, the neighborhood made an application, frankly wasn't a very good one, it was more of kind of a delay and harassing application that it wasn't complete. But those, a year, 2 years ago, got cleaned up, and the definition of what is a complete application, what they have to turn in to be complete is much better defined today.
My recollection is it says essentially something along the lines of that they have to turn in all the materials that the staff would need to review to take action.
Yeah, and we have an ordinance that details what that is.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
That is a place where developers usually trip up those. They put in that application and it's not technically complete, therefore it's not really fast. That's a common mistake that gets made.
Now, well, anyway, that's another issue. Okay, so I was going to say something else, but it's off topic. We can't, now, this section of code also says we cannot impose a requirement that's not expressed in the LUDMA or a municipal ordinance or a specification for public improvement. So in other words, if the requirements, once their application is in, the only requirements that can be applied to that application are the requirements that are already in code. Okay? Okay, so this leads to, so that's vesting. Any questions about vesting before we move on to exactions? And thank you for asking the questions as we go. Please feel free to do that, that's great. Okay, so one problem that development creates is that development, and this is kind of, the view of this has grown and expanded over time, is this recognition that development in one area eventually leads to costs, either in that area or another area. It increases the population of the city, it increases the use of the roads around the development, it increases the required size of the sewer lines, and so the city has to build infrastructure every time there's development, or eventually every time there's development. Okay, so the cities came up with this great plan several years ago that, hey, let's, instead of just increasing property taxes in order to pay for infrastructure, let's push the costs off of the taxpayers and onto the developer that's making the money, theoretically, from the development, right? And so they have three tools to do this. The first one is exactions, and that's where you exact an amenity from the developer. You say to the developer, okay, we're going to approve you building this subdivision, but you've got to put in all the sidewalks and the curb and gutter all the way around. Okay? The next one is dedications, which is where we say, okay, we're going to approve your subdivision, but because your subdivision is right along this street and you're going to put 1,200 people into the neighborhood, the street's eventually going to have to be widened, so we want 10 feet of your property that we're going to keep and we're going to use it for widening the road later. Okay? Impact fees. Impact fees are more about less direct results, not necessarily results that happen right on the property that's being developed, but that might happen elsewhere. And so one of the common examples that we've already talked about is, okay, we're now going to have 2,000 more people in the city. We don't have enough parks to accommodate 2,000 more people, so we're going to have to build another park. It might be on the other side of the city, but we're going to have to build it. So we're going to charge you an impact fee that basically assesses your share of us building a new park in the future. Okay. Any questions about those? Okay. So the issue, though, yeah. Go
So
ahead.
the impact fees they're for every single grouping. So they're for parks, they're for sewer, they're for any impact that this new development will bring to the city, and they're all. And then those uses have to be used for. So if it's sewer impact, then it has to be used for sewer. And if it's
Correct.
parks or taking away land, then they have to provide the parks. If it's so, they could have multiple impact fees from all of these different.
Right, and
areas.
often do. We have, I don't know the list of all of them, but, and in fact, I'll preview this because this comes up in one of the later slides, which is that there's a very important legal distinction between taxes and fees, okay? Constitutionally and under the state constitution, cities cannot impose taxes unless the state legislature says they can. So anything that, so a lot of times what court battles over fees revolve around is the issue of, is it a fee or is it a tax? Because if the court determines it's a tax and there's not a state statute that says you can charge that tax, then it's illegal, okay? So it needs to be a fee. So the definition of a fee is a cost that's directly associated with a service that is being provided to the person that's paying the fee, or a cost to the city that directly arises out of the activity that person is doing that the city is regulating. So we can only do impact fees where we've done a study that says, okay, if you put in this many units, then that's generally going to contribute this much to future park development or future sewer line development. And if we have a study that says that, then we can charge them their portion of it, even if we're going to build the sewer line or the park across the city from them. Does that make sense?
Does it include opportunity cost, or is it actual cost?
It's pretty much actual costs. Yeah, it's hard to make the argument for things other than actual costs.
So, for example, on Joaquin Village, because it was so huge, my understanding is that the sewer pipes and the water pipes and all of those things had to be replaced and increased in size all the way around it because, you know, there just wasn't, the infrastructure wasn't adequate for the number of students that were going to be living there. And so that would have been determined ahead of time, maybe what that's going to cost the city, and that developer had to pay that amount.
Well, generally, go ahead, Jerry.
In that specific case, a direct impact to a system adjacent to a product would be an exaction or something like that. But for your project, we wouldn't need a 12-inch pipe, we only need an 8-inch pipe. So that's a direct cost of the project.
So the city would say, you have to increase that pipe size, Mr. Developer, you have to build that yourself.
He has to build
Yeah,
that
you
himself.
pay for it, you do all of that. Then in addition, they would charge impact fees for the overall theoretical impact to the city sewer system.
Larger system.
In that, now that you're increasing population, and as population increases, someday we'll need a new sewer treatment facility, and therefore you pay your proportionate share of that new sewer treatment facility. You don't have to pay for all of it, just your impact on future sewer treatment.
So that brings up a good point. I should clarify, my examples don't show this. Exactions can be in the form of money. They don't have to be in the form of actually building something. So an exaction is direct impact directly on the land that's being developed. Impact fees are for impacts arising kind of in the future from the development.
And a good example of that would be, my project comes in, because my project's there, we need a new turn lane and a new signal on the road adjacent to the project. They pay the city $500,000 and we put in the signal. They don't do it. They pay that fee to us and we do the work. We do the same thing with energy, putting in transformers and things like that.
And so if we're going to charge an exaction, we actually do need to figure out what the cost of that impact is. If we're doing an impact fee, those usually have a formula that generates what the impact fee is going to be. Do you have a question, Kim?
Well, when he was talking about the sewer increase in the sewer size, just reminds me of the Celebrations Broadview. I'm not sure what is it called, Broadview, Matt?
Yes.
No. But we, in our development agreement, it looks as though the city has agreed to put in this bigger pipe at lift station, but the developer is not required to finish the project. They're not required to. It just kind of seems lopsided, where the city is invested in putting in this infrastructure, but the developer is not really even, from the way it seems anyway, the developer's not, doesn't even have to finish the
Yeah, and so that's one of the issues that we'll get to. A potential issue about development agreements is they trap isn't the word I want to use, but they commit you. They cement you into something, right? And so I can only assume that the public policy argument at the time was, well, this development is going to bring the city so many benefits that it's actually more in our favor to have it happen than the developers, so we're going to contribute more than the developers contribute. But a few years down the road, that may not seem to make any sense anymore. Okay. So now the issue here that arises, and the tension that arises with cities, that again, and this, I promise this is leading back to development agreements, is that there are constitutional limitations on what cities can do with exactions. So they may be unconstitutional under the Fifth Amendment unless they meet two requirements. And these are the two famous cases in this arena. You'll hear them all the time: Nolan and Dolan, the Nolan and Dolan standards. Okay. So the Nolan case says that there has to be an essential nexus between the condition being imposed and the development. If the condition being imposed is not directly tied in somehow to the impact of the development itself, you can't do it. You can't ask for it. You can't require it. Okay? Then the Dolan case then says that in addition to that, and this case, so the Dolan case involved a commercial construction project, and the city wanted them to build, I don't remember how much, miles and miles of trails, right, for public use. And so the controversy was, well, okay, there isn't necessarily a question that because the trail is right next to the property and people have to be able to get by the property, there's not a question of whether or not there's a nexus between the trail and the commercial property, but is the amount of trail being required so far out of line with the impact of the property that it's no longer fair, that it's a taking.
Might also mention it's in addition to an existing development, which has another implication.
Right. Yeah. And so this Dolan case says that in addition to the requirement that there's a nexus, there also has to be a rough proportionality between what you're asking for and what negative impact they're going to have. Okay. And then we already talked about this, but another issue that involves exactions is there's been several court cases over, is it a tax or is it a fee? And there's a quote here: courts uniformly strike down as an unauthorized tax land development conditions where there isn't enabling legislation authorizing the fee. So there needs to be some kind of statute that says, there often needs to be a statute saying usually needs to be a statute saying you can charge the fee. Okay. Much like we just talked about investing, after a few years, the state legislature came back and they passed an exactions law that says pretty much what Nolan and Dolan says, but it says it in state code. And so it says you can impose an exaction if there's an essential link and if the exaction is roughly proportionate. Okay, so pretty much the same thing as Nolan and Dolan. Okay, so now we finally get back to development agreements. Then I'm going to sit down. Well, in a second, I'll sit down and let Matt talk about how we've used them. So there's this tension. There's these two things that both the parties want that are viewed through the lens of the legal framework that I just showed you. The developers worry about vesting because they worry, is the vesting rule soon enough to really help me? And where this comes up the most, especially, I mean, Utah's rule is pretty liberal with this completed application thing, but where it often comes up is in multi-phase development. If I submit an application for phase one, then I'm good for phase one, but what if my break-even point is after I build phase two, and I get done with phase one, and they change the rules before I submit my application for phase two? And so developers that want to do that size of projects, they have this fear, this risk analysis of, okay, maybe I don't want to start this because if I start on phase one and the neighbors get up in arms and they go to the council and or community development and they change the zoning laws, I'll never be able to build phase two and I'm going to go bankrupt. Okay, so that's the developer's side. The city's side is that there's all these things they want because as the city, we want all the things that we can have and not have to pay for them in the world, right? I mean, anything that we can get and not have to pay for, that's great for the city, right? It's great for the budget. So the city has this inherent desire to have as many things as they can have, even though some of those things, even though the legal rules that we just talked about may say you can't have those things. Okay? So here's what happens: is developer agreements arise, and they're currently only authorized in 15 states, but they arrived 20 years ago or so, and they start, and some states start doing them. There's now 15 states that allow them. Utah started allowing them in 2005. And they're designed, at least the history of them, is that they're designed to meet this tension between vesting and, between the developer's desire for vesting and the city's desire for getting things that they couldn't otherwise get. And so let's read some definitions. The purpose of the development agreement is to vest certain development rights in the landowner developer in exchange for construction and dedication of public improvements. So in other words, what this says is what the purpose of the agreement is to say is for the city to say, we promise not to change the rules on you if you promise to give us stuff that we couldn't otherwise have. Right? So if you'll build the park for us that we could only charge you 1/3 of the impact fees to pay for, we'll promise that we won't change the rules even if it takes you 10 years to build.
So I understand all this agreement thing.
Okay.
So when does the agreement become binding by law? If one of the parties breaks such agreement, what happens?
Okay, so
Can we get to that?
So the philosophy, we've got a ways to go yet, but the basic answer to that is the philosophy of this is that these are private contracts, that they're voluntary contracts between the city and the developer, and so whichever party feels like the other side hasn't kept their agreement, they sue. Okay, so the idea is if the development agreement says you're going to build the park and they don't build the park, we sue them to either make them build the park or give us the money to build the park ourselves. On the flip side, if our agreement is to not change the zoning and we change the zoning, then they sue us to say you can't really change the zoning. Okay, so but we're going to get, after Matt talks again, we'll get more into that. Okay, just to reemphasize this, it's an alternative to reliance on judicially protected vested rights. It removes certainty by providing the developer with an assurance regulations will not change. It can provide local government with public benefits it could not otherwise achieve by regulation, while concurrently providing a developer with assurance that they're going to be allowed to proceed. In fact, the primary purpose of these agreements is to vest the rights of the landowner to proceed with whatever development is the subject of the agreement. And so again, I put all of these quotes up there to show that from a variety of sources that this is where development agreements came from and what the intent was when they started. And then finally, it's a bilateral contract between the developer and the municipality, and it says exactly what I've already said about what the two of them agree to, okay? Including the part about the things that we might not otherwise legally be able to ask for. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to Matt and have him talk. So what I've presented is the history and legal framework of traditional development agreements, big D, big A. Okay, Matt's going to now talk about how after they developed this way outside of Utah, how they began to be used here, and particularly by Provo. And then when he's done with that, I'm going to stand back up and talk and answer your question finally, which is what legal issues pertain to using them the way that we've used them, or even the way that they've traditionally been used. And then Matt and I will go together over kind of some pros and cons.
I remind you that we're just a little over half an hour remaining.
Can I say something? Just for my own, I think I understand. I just like to get to what you're trying to do. I understand that you're doing a very good job of developing this for us, and I appreciate that. But I understand it now. Do I speak for everybody? What are you trying to do? You want to go? You want to tell us?
First, the primary objective is understanding the tool, and understanding the tool so you can use it in a way, in an informed way. Okay, and that's particularly for the council, because they're the ones that will actually be authorizing the mayor to execute these agreements.
And let me throw out there that we're not trying to do anything. The council,
you brought us here.
Well, no, we didn't. The council brought you here because the council has had discussions in the past about the proper use of development agreements, and questions about that have been asked. And so they asked to have this meeting so that we could make a presentation about what what the information that they wanted about development.
Which is very good. I appreciate it very much.
And I would really hope that we could get to what the planning commission can realistically do to add language into our recommendations that would facilitate development agreements, or that, looking forward to that.
Okay. And
That would be helpful, because we're kind of not sure.
And that's definitely part of where I'm going.
I will try and move quickly to be sensitive to your time. Development agreements, I think, again, I wasn't involved in in their genesis. I think the first development agreements arose about the same time as this example I threw up earlier of the office building. Okay, I think that was one of the catalysts for the creation. As we go back and study the content of these development agreements, they're primarily used for a few things. One, again, to ensure that what was presented to the council is actually what is delivered. And so that's very common language in every development agreement we've had, talking about material modifications, or I'm going to interpret that to be substantial, or maybe not even substantial, but how do we define material modification?
Yeah, let's not go there.
Let's not go there. All development agreements, basically the essence is, if you modify this way in any material way, okay, then what was presented, you must come back to the council for an amendment of the agreement. Okay. And this was, I believe, to help ensure that what the council understood that they were approving would actually be developed and built. That the developer would actually be tied, and that no matter what the underlying zoning allowed, they'd be committed to do that. Okay? Committed to build what they presented. As the agreement developed over the course of several years, between '98 to 2004, actually the first several years, that was pretty much their sole purpose. As I reviewed early development agreements. Eventually, some subdivisions were being built on the west side, and one of the concerns of the council at the time was a continuing trend of what they were seeing, that, well, yes, we may be approving 8,000 square foot lots, but our zoning code has a minimum 1,200 square foot standard. We're fearful that these neighborhoods are going to turn into first-time home buyers, and then the subsequent generation maybe rentals. How do we get around that? Not get around that, but how do we dissuade that from occurring? And so those concerns were expressed, and developers would say, well, I would promise to build a larger home. A minimum standard, 1,500 square foot for a single family, 2,000. I think the upward limits of some of these agreements said 1,800 square feet for a single family home, 2,000 square feet for a two-story home. Now, in addition, especially on the west side, this is always square footage is always a concern, because most of the west side does not allow for basements. Okay. So where what maybe typically fine for a 1,200 square foot home with a basement would really be effective of a 2,400 square foot home, that wouldn't be the case on the west side, because that minimum 1,200 square footage only applied to the first floor, not any subterranean portion of the house. Occupancy was another concern that was often expressed by stakeholders and by the council. Okay, and that and there was a movement to encourage owner occupancy throughout all neighborhoods, and that's articulated in the general plan several times. And our current zoning allows for a family or 3 singles, and so we started to see development agreements where the council expressed this concern. Well, you could put 3 singles in here, it would still turn into a rental. We'd sure not like that to happen. We'd really like to encourage the family occupancy situation. And the response would be, well, I'd limit that to family or 2 adults and their children. Okay, and so these were specific requirements that the developer would proffer or offer to assuage or the concern of the council, okay? And they would be committed to in the agreement. So again, as Brian Jones has said, we promise as a city that we'll give you the zoning and that we won't take it away from you if, again, one, you will build it as proposed. Two, and then we start to see the development of what's commonly referred to as Exhibit E in this development agreement, or the special conditions. And the special conditions had grown. Some of them were fairly boilerplate that they started reiterating in every version of the development agreement. Some of them seemed sort of almost like restatements of the zoning code, almost to reinforce what the zoning already required in some instances. In some instances, it was agreements that went above and beyond what the zoning code would require. Sometimes these development agreements would start looking at, well, we're not satisfied with the type of materials that the zoning would permit. On the west side, it would be typically vinyl siding, especially during the late 90s, early 2000s. And so some design elements would be agreed upon in the code, maybe upgrading the materials to a hardy board or a stucco product to make, again, in this goal to make this west side homes a more desirable project. These projects would then start being applied to rezone efforts. You mentioned the RC zoning, set aside the pro zone discussion, development of that, but as developers would come in for single parcel rezone or conglomeration or single project rezones, that's what to develop higher densities, sort of on a case-by-case basis. The development agreement became an important tool, especially as one thing to tie it to single-family homes where every home could look different. As another thing, when the developer, much like this gas or office building, the council wanted some assurances that what we're seeing is what's going to be built. So that's typically how they've been used, and in Provo, and I think that's probably a good opportunity for Brian to come back up. Any questions on that from you?
I got a question about that. Those things, the way we've been using them, apparently are not able, by the planning commission or the city council, we are not allowed to suggest to the developer. He has to bring that forward. Is that something?
I'm going to let Brian.
I'm going to get into that. That's going to be a major portion of this. So, okay, so here's the question. Are development agreements legal? And I'm going to preface this with a couple comments. And I apologize. I had it until 9 on my calendar, but I'll try to get it. We'll try to be done by 8:30 instead. But there's a reason why people hate lawyers. There's several reasons. There's several reasons why people hate lawyers. One of them is that the answer to every question is it depends. Okay, and the answer to this question is it depends. So, and
joke.
No, that's still coming. But so to the extent, so I'm giving away the punchline right now to the extent that it is a joke. That's the answer. The answer is it depends. Okay. So here's the other joke. When we first got married, my wife and I were planning a trip. I don't remember any of the details of the trip, but I remember we were having this conversation, and I said to her, "Well, what if this happens?" And she said, "Well, that's not going to happen, but I guess we'll do this." And I said, "Well, what if this happens?" She said, "That's not going to happen. That's stupid. But we'll do this." And I said, "Well, what if this happens?" And she said, "You are such a pessimist." And I was really offended because I think that I'm actually kind of a positive guy and that I wasn't expecting any of these things to happen, right? But so I thought about this a lot, and I came back to her a few days later and I said, the problem is not that I'm a pessimist. The problem is that I'm paranoid. Right? And I don't really mean that I'm paranoid either, but what I mean by that is I believe in the philosophy of prepare for the worst and expect the best, right? That preparation involves identifying risks. Because risks exist doesn't mean that you shouldn't do something. I absolutely love playing football, tore my knee to pieces in high school, and continued to play for years until I got to the point where I couldn't go out for more than 10 minutes before my knee would give out on me again, and I eventually had to have surgery, and I decided, okay, the risks are too great. So the point of all of that is, every legal question, or at least most legal questions, are at the end of the day a risk analysis. So when I first started working for the council, somebody said, let's do a development agreement. And I said, the heck is that? Okay, so I went and I started doing some research, and all of the definitions that I read about what they are were the things that we just read a few minutes ago. And I said, that doesn't seem like what we're doing here. So is that a problem? I asked myself that question, is that a problem? And then the council, and then it came up again, and the council said, can we do this? And I said, it depends. And I didn't talk very much about all the reasons why we want to do them, because they already knew all those. I said, here are potential risks that I see. It was never my, to talk straight, as we talk about in speech trust, it was never my intent to say, you should not do these. It was my intent to say, here's some risks that I've identified. You ought to be aware of these before you decide whether to use it or not. Okay? So that's the intent of this conversation. So the question is, if what the developer wants and what the city wants in a development agreement are things that you can't normally do, can you get around that by just drafting a contract that says you can do them? And again, the answer depends. But there's two reasons why they've been challenged. And I'll try to be fast with this. Okay, so there's this thing called the police power. Not really the power to have police. It's the power to promote health, safety, and general welfare of the public. Okay? It's called the reserved powers doctrine because that power is reserved by the federal constitution to the states because it's not given specifically to the federal government. Okay? So because it's reserved to the states, it's held by municipal governments because they're subdivisions of the state. We won't talk about the deliverable. So but the issue here is that because they have that power, courts have regularly held that cities or local governments can't give away that power. They can't contract away their power to act in the general welfare of the public. So this arises in zoning context, and it's something that's sometimes called contract or conditional zoning. And where it arises is if you enter into a contract that says, in essence, what the courts think it says is we're not going to exercise our police power in the future. Okay? So skipping to the punchline, there's an example in a few minutes about a California case where they signed a development agreement, and the development agreement says, we promise to expedite and assist your future approvals for this project. And the California court said, you can't do that because you've just promised not to exercise your police power if at the time you get to that point the police power dictates that you shouldn't expedite or approve or assist their approvals. So you can't promise to do that, and they voided the development agreement because of that. Okay? The other way that it comes up is or that it's been attacked is if one council says the city promises to do this forever into the future. Well, let me back up and see this. If one council changes a zoning law, the next council or the next council or the council 50 years from now can say, just kidding, we're going back to what it was before, or we're changing it some other way. If you sign a legally binding contract that says we'll never do such and such, then no council in the future can ever say anything contrary to that. And some court cases and some legal commentaries believe that that's illegal because you're binding future councils contrary to, so that they can't use their police power. Okay, we won't talk about spot zoning. Okay, so here's some quotes from some of the books. Developer agreements are controversial in some states because of this issue of whether they bargain away their power. The approval freeze is the most important part, but there's a question of whether that's an unconstitutional bargaining away. Okay, so sorry, it was a Florida case. So there's the Florida case that I just talked about. Directly contrary to that, there's a Nebraska case that says, hey, look, this isn't, you're not giving up your power. Your contract actually allows you to do things that the zoning code couldn't do, so you've actually enhanced your power by signing this contract. We think that's great use of police power. Okay? So again, this is why I say it depends, because the courts are in different positions depending on where you're at, and there's not a Utah case. So now a note that this may be, it may be a case of be careful what you wish for. In most of the cases that I looked at that talk about whether development agreements violate this reservation of the police power, it was actually the city that was arguing that it did. Okay? Because again, there's this thing of the inflexibility, right? It's the one that you raised, the celebrations one, right? It's the city now saying, we think that this future council shouldn't have bound us, so we don't want the development agreement to be valid. And for the most part, the courts have rejected that argument and said, no, that's too bad for you. And in that case, they ended up paying out $32 million, I think. So to kind of give you the answer to this question, most of the cases seem to say that development agreements are okay as far as in respect to this particular issue, but not all of them. Some jurisdictions say it's not. So that's where the risk comes from. So here's some things that we can do. First thing is make sure there's an enabling statute. Well, we've got one in the state, and I'll talk really briefly about it in a second. But maybe we need one in the city too to define what the process is. That's one possible option. Maybe we need to restrict the purposes for which we use them to the purposes that are listed in the statute. And I'll show you those again in a slide in just a second. One of the issues that's really big in these reserved powers cases is when the agreements go for a long time. So if you're only binding the city for 5 years or 10 years, that's not seen as unreasonable as if you're binding them for 50 years. Okay? So we had a developer the other day that said, we were working on a development agreement, and they wanted us to sign in, they wanted us to put in a clause that said, the agreement's valid until you get it built. Well, okay, what if it takes you 50 years to build it? Okay? So we fought back against that. Avoid promises about future approvals. We talked about why that's a delegation. Include escape clauses that say, if you're going, that we can get out of this if there's a vital need to exercise the police power. Hold a hearing on and actually approve the actual agreement instead of, as we've done recently in the past, just the idea that there will be an agreement. And a lot of the states that have, I showed you our statute that just uses the word twice. Hawaii and Florida and California, most of the states that have them, it's an entire chapter of the code that defines all of the requirements for using a development agreement. And most of them require a public hearing. Don't violate the general plan. Don't execute a development agreement that rezones something contrary to the general plan. That's almost always frowned upon. I talked about the local ordinance. Okay, so here's the enabling statute. The enabling statute was passed in 2005. Just so you don't feel like you're the only ones or I'm the only one confused by this, I wanted to show you the next slide. I looked at the legislative history of the 2005 ordinance, and I found this report from the task force that worked on it. And it has this chart in it that says, okay, here are the issues that we put in the ordinance. Some of them we had a little disagreement about, some of them were moderately hot, and some of them were mind benders. Okay, so that's what the State Commission on the LUDMA Act thought about development agreements. Okay, very good. Okay, so I made the point earlier about maybe we limit the uses to what's listed in the statute. Now this is pretty broad. This is a pretty big list, right? But maybe we need, one possible outcome is ask ourselves every time we do one, is the thing that we're asking for, is the condition we're asking for really included in this list? It's just, an option to make it safer. Okay. Second reason why they're challenged, governmental abuse. They've been challenged on the basis that because the things that you're asking for are otherwise illegal, you just shouldn't be able to ask for them. And I'll skip to the next one. Okay, circumvention. So it asks this question. If the condition doesn't have an essential nexus and it's not roughly proportional, and the Supreme Court has said it's therefore unconstitutional to require it, should you really be able to ask for it? Okay, that's the policy question. Okay, so and then here's a quote about the fact that that question exists. So we can pass these slides out later, and you can leave this at another time. But the crux of the matter is that some courts and some commentators believe it's difficult to tell whether the landowner's acceptance is truly voluntary or not. Okay, that becomes the issue. There's a New Jersey Supreme Court ruling just from a couple years ago where they had a development agreement. They said the developer was going to have to pay for all of these off-site improvements. The economy tanked. They could only build a third of their project. They sued and won, and the New Jersey Supreme Court said, yeah, rough proportionality still exists. All this agreement is just a way of dictating what the rough proportionality is. But since they could only build a third of their project, they only have to build a third of the off-site improvements. Okay? Now again, not every court's going to come down that way, but that's a possibility. Okay, so voluntariness. So the opposing argument, the one we just said, is to say, well, look, no one and no one apply because those are being imposed by the government. That's not what we're talking about. Here we're talking about two parties getting together and saying, we both want to do this. Okay, that's the opposing argument. However, while it's true that the right to develop on one's own land is not a governmental benefit, well, not however, this is a quote supporting the argument that they really are voluntary, that you shouldn't have to worry about this voluntary argument. And it says, well, let me skip down to here. The authorities cited in support of the against position concern exactions imposed as required conditions to development. In the case of a development agreement, the municipality is not granting the landowner the right to develop or imposing conditions on such development. Instead, it's promising to protect the investment by not enforcing any subsequent land use regulation. Okay, so here's my one Socratic method moment. Anybody see the problem between this quote and what Matt was saying as far as how we've used them? Okay, he's saying the reason why you don't have to worry about the voluntariness argument is because they already have the right to develop and you're not giving it to them. That whole argument completely disappears if the reason we're giving them the development agreement is because they need it in order to be able to develop, because they need the rezone. Now, again, I'm not saying that's a deal killer, but it's a caution. Okay? Okay. So anyway, that's what I just said. So does that same argument even apply where a rezone is necessary to move forward? Okay. Here's some best practices to avoid that. Avoid excessive conditions. There's a saying among lawyers that bad facts make bad law. If you put yourself in a situation where the facts, no matter how good your argument that they were technically legal at the time you did them, seem unreasonable to a court, they're going to strike you down and say that that's illegal, right? And then you're going to have this rule that says that's illegal, and it's because you overreached, right? So the principle here, and again, these are just suggestions of ways we can mitigate what the risks that have been identified. The more excessive the conditions seem, the more likely it seems to me that the court might say, okay, you're violating this rule about rough proportionality in a way that we can't stomach. Avoid conditions that aren't truly for a public purpose. There's a Hawaii case about a development agreement where they were supposed to build a road, and when they dug down into the record, they said, you know, there's nothing in the record that shows that the road really benefits the city. It looks like there's at least an argument that it benefits the guy next door and he's the only one. And so we're gonna send this back to the trial court to have a whole other trial on just that issue, because if that's the case, we're not going to uphold it. Okay. Again, the recommendation to hold a hearing on it. Now, this is probably going to be the biggest controversial one. And again, I'm not advocating for this, but I'm saying, based on the things that we just read, one possible policy decision to mitigate risks is to say, look, we're not going to use these with rezones because that's where the voluntariness argument causes us the most problems. That may not be the right answer, but that's one possibility. And so, but if you don't want to do that, then here's some suggestions. If you are going to use it with rezones, it's probably vital that you avoid any explicit mention that the rezone is contingent upon the development agreement. Okay? If the developer stands up and says, you know, I've heard you guys have all these concerns. I would love to sign a contract that says I will definitely do those things. Okay? And if the court's looking at that, that looks very voluntary.
But how often?
Okay, well, and so the next slide will teach you. Okay? So, but if we say, man, I just cannot fathom passing this unless I have a development agreement that says X, Y, and Z, so I feel comfortable, that doesn't look so voluntary anymore. Or at least has the potential not to be voluntary. Okay, so build a record, which in the document that Matt sent out yesterday, he refers to this as the dance. Okay, so here's the potential thing. The council member says, I'm uncomfortable with X, Y, and Z about this rezone. I just don't think I can pass it because I'm so worried about the impacts of these things. And the developer says, no problem. I will sign it. I will promise to take care of those things. And the council member thinks to himself, okay, I can't say development agreement, so I will say, well, how do I know that you're going to do those things now that you promised to do them? And in an ideal world, the developer responds and says, I'll give you a development agreement. Yay! Okay, so we negotiate the development agreement, we have another hearing, and we approve it, and we're good to go. Okay, scenario 2 was honestly much more common. The developer responds to that question and says,
Trust me.
yeah, because I promised to, right? So here's my recommendation, and I don't know how much this helps the planning commission, because this is more about the council members, but although you could do the same thing with Gary in the room, right? The council members continue to think, okay, I shouldn't mention development agreement, and they turn to me and say, well, how have we handled this in the past? And I say, again, emphasizing that we're not asking for anything, well, sometimes when people have wanted to promise things in the past, they've offered to do a development agreement to memorialize those promises. If that's something you're interested in, I'd be happy to sit down and talk to you about it, show you some of the ones we've done before. And then again, hopefully, the developer says, great, fantastic, I'm on board, and we're good to go. The potential problem is deviations. Okay, yeah.
Could I suggest that in there you also have another meeting to approve the specific agreement?
Right.
Specifically, in that, ask the developer, have the chair ask the developer, are you doing this of your own free
yes.
will and choice? There's no coercion, just ask him.
Great point. I meant to put that in my slide. That's actually one of the reasons why I think the subsequent hearing is important, because it allows you to build that record. Yeah.
It doesn't appear as a ruse when you say we're not going to approve the rezone until you have a subsequent meeting to discuss what.
Well,
yes. It's a better ruse.
That's the danger, right? That's the danger. But again, the importance is, and when I say build a record, remember that your decisions as a council are generally held up to an arbitrary and capricious standard, and so what you need to have is an articulable reason for doing what you're doing. So the record needs to show that you talked over and over and over again, not about the fact that you needed a development agreement, but that reasons X, Y, and Z made you uncomfortable with the rezone. That you just couldn't see this project going forward because of X, Y, and Z. And I think maybe this is on the next. No, I didn't put it on the slide.
So in the planning commission, in the case of the planning commission, if I, as a commissioner, was uncomfortable with a rezone, because maybe two different items, I articulate that and maybe move to continue it to give the developer more time to work with the planning staff. Is that a good option, or what's a better option?
Probably, frankly, in that situation, my initial reaction is maybe not. That if it's a rezone and you're uncomfortable with the rezone for XYZ reasons, it might be a really good thing for the planning commission to say, we recommend denial because we're uncomfortable with A and B. Right. That recommendation then goes to the council for a hearing, and the developer comes in and says, well, planning commission recommended no because they were uncomfortable with A and B. I'm willing to take care of that issue by, offering to take care of those things. Therefore, A and B are not an issue anymore, council. Right. Are you now willing to, that's why specific reasons for an approval or a denial or a condition are very important.
I agree wholeheartedly, and it's a subtle distinction, but I think I would argue that you're better off saying, I recommend denial because of X, Y, and Z, or I recommend denial unless X, Y, and Z are taken care of, instead of saying, I recommend approval if X, Y, and Z are taken care of.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's what happens more often than not, and it's at the root of our meeting here tonight.
And that's an important thing to know.
It is.
So rather than just throw it out there and hope that it all works out if, X, Y, and Z are taken care of, we're better off to recommend denial and articulate very clearly the reasons why.
Because that sends a strong message to the council that you're not saying we like this, but we also think you ought to consider taking care of these things. You're saying we don't like this unless these things are taken care of, and it gives the council a record to build upon to say, yeah, I don't want to do this because I agree with these same concerns.
The planning commission, as well as the council, engages with neighborhood chairs, and I think neighborhood chairs and their associates have a similar problem and that we just discussed. And it would be helpful if, when they're providing feedback to the council or the planning commission, that they could say, look, we just don't recommend that you adopt this because of X, Y, and Z concerns to us. That always gives this developer an opportunity to respond of how he will try and mitigate it. It's his idea. I will try and mitigate it X, Y, A, B, and C way. And that becomes his proposal and his offer.
Bill? Gary?
So I just have a question, if you can. What I don't understand is this: the developer comes in as part of his rezoning process, and he submits a site plan, and he submits architectural drawings, and he submits a materials board. And in submitting all of those things, he's actually proffering a whole bunch of stuff.
Right.
And the city says, well, we like this plan because it's got underground parking, and we like this building materials. So because of these things you proffered, that are documented right here in all your plans, we like this project. We want to memorialize what you have proffered in a development agreement. Why is that not proffered?
Yeah, that seems voluntary.
Well, okay, it probably, now there's a distinction between saying, we'd like a commitment from you to do everything that you've already told us you'll do, and saying, we'd like an agreement, we'd like something to memorialize all the things you'd already told us and these other 5 things that we don't like.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the latter,
Right.
I'm talking about the former.
So that certainly makes it much less of a problem in my view. It's certainly, I think, better if planning staff does it than, because you can say, as planning staff, you can say, you know, I have to make a recommendation to the planning commission and they have to make a recommendation to council. Man, I really don't think that I can recommend to planning staff that this be approved unless we've got a commitment that this is really what's happening, right? And again, you're raising the issue that what bothers you is that there are specific issues that there needs to be a commitment for. But it's much less, in my view, it's much less problematic for planning staff to do it than the council.
But that was exactly the factual situation with Silverado and North University. That was exactly the factual situation.
And often a rezone comes up where well, I guess what I'm trying to say is, we like it. The developer likes it. That's their proposal. You go back to the one on 8th or 5th West and 8th North. That's the office building. That's what the developer wanted to do. Didn't want to do a gas station. Gas station was pretty far down the list for the developer to actually do. And so everybody was agreeing it was a voluntary thing. But what happens is once you get that zoning, you can come in and amend your project plan, and we have no right to say no. And so, I think if what Bill's saying is, okay, so the developer's coming in, he's saying, this is my project plan, I'm agreeing to do this. Is there a mechanism in the development agreement or something, or covenant that could run with the land that guarantees that that project and only that project will be built?
Well, yeah, it depends. Right? No, but I think you raise it. Yeah, that's the issue is, if they're voluntarily saying, I'm doing all this stuff anyway, and you can say, now there's a couple of policy questions in there too, right?
Yeah,
which is, okay, if we're asking for a development agreement, that implies that we would be willing to enforce the development agreement if they didn't follow it. Do we really want to sue every single person that doesn't build what they said? Or do we reserve that only for certain cases? Do we look at one neighborhood and go, you know what, this neighborhood is perfect for commercial development no matter what the project is, so why ask for a development agreement? But this one is only good for commercial development if the project we've seen gets built. And we're, by heck, going to sue you if you don't build the project that you showed to us. Then there's much more of a reason for doing that. But again, anything you can do to build the record of the voluntariness mitigates this risk.
Well, and I asked that really to come back to the policy question I think the Council and Planning Commission need to struggle with, which is how often do you want to use development agreements? I can remember a couple of development agreements in the past that literally had nothing in them that was not already in the underlying ordinance. But there was a development agreement with it. And development agreements are difficult for us to administer, because it's not the ordinance, it's another layer of regulation that I have to make sure in training with our people that they go out and did you look at this, look for a development agreement as opposed to just the ordinances that they're used to. So anytime we go outside of normal standard operating procedure, it gets difficult and the likelihood of mistake or error creeps in.
And I don't know how many had a chance to read Matt's article, but and look at if you did already read it, look at the new one, because I actually made some modifications to his language about two of the items, which is that, remember what your enforcement remedy is, right? If it's in the ordinance, we file a criminal action, a zoning violation, criminal action in the justice court. We handle several dozen of those every month. We know exactly how to do that. It's a process. It still takes some time to process it, but it's a few weeks of handling that process. If what you're enforcing is a development agreement instead, somebody has to know about the development agreement. Somebody has to find the development agreement. They have to interpret the development agreement, and then we have to file a lawsuit. And it's probably going to be 2 years before it's enforced, right? So there's pros and cons. Okay, one last thing. Go ahead, Paul.
And I think one of the challenges is we have very broad zoning ordinance that allows all sorts of things, and that's the intent. That was the original intent of many zoning ordinances, and that doesn't have to be that way. And we don't have time to get into day-to-day alternatives. But we've inseparably connected, even by our own city ordinance, the requirement to look at a parcel not just for its general qualities. Generally, what type of zoning should be here? What broad array of type of things should we permit in this location? And that's generally what happens in most cities. Okay, but we've taken to where we want complete control. And we're not going to allow a broad array. We're going to allow only this and nothing but this. And that's a policy question too, because what's good today, just as Gary mentioned earlier, may not be good for the market or the community 5, 10, 50 years later. So we've married zoning with project plan approval. Zoning wasn't meant to be married with. Well, I shouldn't say that. Zoning wasn't originally used in that way. It was applied broadly and not so specifically as we've been accustomed to using it.
Let's hear your last point and then we'll conclude.
Okay, very last, and this one more piece of advice specifically for the Planning Commission, because I've already told the council this, that I forgot to include on the slides. When you're having this dialogue and you're saying, we recommend denial because of X, Y, and Z, or unless X, Y, and Z are taken care of. One last piece of advice is make sure that you say what X is and what Y is and what Z is, instead of saying something like, we recommend denial unless the neighborhood concerns are addressed. Right? Because by doing that, you're essentially abdicating your authority to the neighborhood. And you're saying, and it's especially problematic if the council does it, because then they're saying, we don't know whether these are valid issues that we need to exercise our police power on or not. We just know that the neighborhood's unhappy. So if you make them happy, we'll sign off on it. Okay? Don't do that. Listen to their concerns. Every one of their concerns that you think is valid, adopt it as your own concern specifically. Does that make sense? Okay. So I have two handouts that I'm not going to read either of these two slides, but I will give you the documents. Just some other views besides my own. There's an article from Roger Baker that I'll hand out to all of you. He's the city attorney for Tooele, who's currently paying a $22.5 million judgment to a developer because of a development agreement, so he's maybe a little bit biased about development agreements. He wrote an article in the Utah Planning Association newsletter that he says this, and then he proceeds to put out a bunch of different reasons why he thinks development agreements are problematic. So I think every risk I agree with every risk he identifies. That doesn't mean I say that I think you shouldn't do them, because then the next article is from a guy, I think he's from Florida, but I'm not positive, and he's got an article twice as long about all the reasons why contract zoning is the greatest thing in the world. And I agree with everything he says about why you might want to do it and what it might hopefully accomplish. The question for all of you is to weigh the potential risks of doing it against the benefits that you hope to derive from doing it. And I go back to this quote from Roger that I especially like. If the city will not receive more from a development agreement than it would from the routine application of its land use ordinance, they shouldn't enter into the development agreement. So it's a risk benefit analysis, and that's done.
Will we be able to get copies of this slide?
Yes.
Can I just summarize what we didn't cover, and then just very briefly? We intended on talking a little bit more about what are, and I used the word perceived advantages, because perception is in the eye of the beholder. What may be an advantage to the council may not be an advantage to the neighborhood or the developer, and vice versa. Perceived disadvantages, and then, what are some alternatives? And I think we touched on them lightly. I actually don't get into that in detail, but that could be another substantial 2-hour discussion with the same body.
Rather than convene again in this kind of setting, may I ask the Planning Commission to nominate one of its members to join with a member of the Municipal Council and with our staff and with community development to pursue the matter, to study it and consider alternatives with the object of returning, let's say, early in fall with some recommendations that we can share with you.
Let's nominate somebody tomorrow in our study session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Sorry for
One word of warning to Planning Commission, don't miss tomorrow.
whoever's not there will be nominated.
Whoever's not there.